Okay, sorry about that. This program will be recorded. So if you know anybody who wanted to see it and couldn't make it tonight, please contact the library and I can send them a link to the recording. You'll be muted by the host for the entirety of this program, but if you think of any questions throughout while Chad is talking, please put them in the chat box and we'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the program. The chat feature depends on the device you're using. If you're on a mobile device, you're gonna have to hover over the three dots to get more and then open the chat feature. Otherwise, it should just be on the bottom of your screen when you hover over the bottom of your screen. All right, I think that's all for Zoom housekeeping. Tonight, I am very excited to welcome Chad Lewis, researcher, author, and lecturer on topics of the strange and unusual. Chad's background is in psychology, doing both his bachelor and master's degree work in the field, but for the last 20 plus years, he has traveled the globe in search of unique and bizarre stories in history. From chupacabras in Costa Rica, the Mothman in West Virginia, and national UFO sites, to haunted castles in London, sea serpents and gnomes in Scotland and Ireland, and vampires in Transylvania, Chad has ventured far and wide in search of the strange and unusual. Tonight, we will follow in the footsteps of America's most infamous gangsters as they turned the Midwest into their personal crime vacation land. Filled with deadly bank robberies, explosive shootouts, brutal murders, and daring kidnappings, this Prohibition era presentation will let the audience discover the historic locations where gangster history will never die. And as I'm sure we all know, we have a hot spot up here in Northern Michigan for that, which I'm sure Chad will cover. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chad Lewis.
Well, hello and welcome. First, I'd like to thank the library for having me here this evening, but just as important, all of you who are brave enough to show up to talk about the gangster history of the Midwest from wherever you're watching this program from. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, turn off my video as we explore the gangster history of the Midwest. So bear with me one moment as right now, all of you should be seeing Midwest Gangster Past on your screen. Wonderful, and you should hear me. As Sarah said, my name is Chad Lewis, and I'll be your presenter for this program. And although my background is in the field of psychology, for the last 2.5 decades, I have traveled the world in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from weird roadside attractions to odd places, strange people along the mother road, you name it. If it's just a little offbeat and a little bizarre, I've traveled around the globe in search of these oddities, one of which, this one, many of you might recognize as well. But it wasn't until the early 2000s when I was up in the Northwoods of my home state of Wisconsin, working on a book about haunted places. My car got a flat tire. So I got out, fixed the flat, looked over, and there was a lodge right in front of me. Well, I thought I'd drop in and grab a can of pop. Well, lo and behold, that lodge was called Little Bohemia. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but it seemed as though fate had stepped in and provided me a little detour from things that go bump in the night to things that will bump you off. And that eventually became the book and the program you're going to see this evening, The Gangster History of the Midwest. And I really want this to be a time portal back to the days when the gangsters robbed our banks, they kidnapped our citizens, and they mowed down everybody who got in their way. So for the next 45 or 50 minutes, we'll take a tour across the entire Midwest to the gangsters' favorite hideouts. Of course, the gangsters themselves, they no longer hang out at any of these locations, but the locations themselves are still there. But for how much longer, I don't know. I always encourage people to get to these places while you still can, because every year we're losing more and more of these historic treasures. So with that in mind, put on your zoot suit or your flapper dress as we explore the gangster history of the Midwest. And the first question that has to be asked is, what was it about the Midwest? Why did the gangsters love being here so much? Well, there were several reasons. One, obviously, was our close proximity to Chicago, which during Prohibition was the bootlegging capital of the world, mainly operated by Al Capone on the left of your screen and his arch nemesis, George Bugs Moran, on the right of your screen. Now, a lot of people know of Al thanks in part to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929. Al Capone wanted to get rid of Bugs Moran, who was using this building as a makeshift headquarters for his gang. And Al wanted to get rid of Bugs. So Al came up with a great idea. While he was down in vacationing in Florida with an alibi, he had several of his colleagues dress up as police officers and raid Bugs's place on Valentine's Day. Bugs's men thought it was nothing more than your traditional shakedown. So when the police came in, they put their weapons down. But then they realized these were not police officers. They thought they'd pay them off and go about their business as usual. But instead, the police officers opened fire on them. The landlady next door had a tenant. And inside this building was a dog inside the hideout. And the dog was barking so loud that the neighbor lady sent that tenant over to see what was going on at the Bugs Moran hideout. And the man went over to see why that dog was barking. Now, word of caution, there are probably 3 of these signs that you'll see tonight. And what they mean is that the next slide you're going to see could be graphic, gory, or gruesome. You might not want to see it, which is why I put this warning up. You can close your eyes. I'll tell you when the slide's gone. But if you'd rather not see why that dog was barking so loud, now's a good time to close your eyes and wait for me to invite you back. Because when that man went to see what all the commotion was about, this is what he discovered. All of the men were on the ground dead or in a state of dying. Okay, the photo's gone. The only survivor was the dog, but the dog was so distraught it had to be put to death. George Moran, he wasn't there that day. He had seen the police coming and he turned around as he walked toward his hideout and walked the other way. The case was never officially solved, but when the media asked Moran who he thought was responsible, he said there's only one person in the world that kills like that, and that's Capone. We'll catch up with Scarface a little bit later. Because a few years back, while Chicago was trying to clean up its grisly gangster history, they tore down the building where the Valentine's Day Massacre occurred. Now, as you can see, it's the front lawn of a senior area. But don't worry, like anything today, if you want a piece of the Valentine's Day Massacre, you can go online and buy one of the bricks from the original shootout. They'll set you back about $1,000 per brick. The second reason the gangsters loved the Midwest is they loved St. Paul. And the reason they loved St. Paul, Minnesota, was because of one individual, this gentleman, Police Chief John O'Connor. You see, back in the early 1900s, when every other community was trying to keep criminals out of their city, O'Connor took a different approach. He actually invited crooks from all over the world to go to St. Paul. And if you registered with the St. Paul police, you could do whatever the heck you wanted. Prostitution? No problem. Gambling? Be our guest. But there was one catch to this agreement. You couldn't do it in the city of St. Paul. If you wanted to head to the city of Wilmer, Minnesota, and rob their banks, which you can see they did, you were free to do so, but there'd be no crime inside of St. Paul. Therefore, in the 1920s and 30s, There were more crooks living in the saintly city than nearly anywhere else in the world. Yet it was safer for you to live in St. Paul than nearly anywhere else as well. In fact, so many criminals were in St. Paul that noted bank robber Alvin Creepy Carpus once replied that if he was thinking of a friend of his he hadn't seen in a while, he immediately thought of two places, prison or St. Paul, because if his buddy wasn't in one, he was probably in the other one. We'll catch up with Carpus a little bit later as well. The third reason they love the Midwest is the same reason we love the Midwest, the Northwoods, the beautiful North. When both the literal and figurative heat was too much for them down in Chicago and down south, they would come up to the Northwoods of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The seclusion they loved, the cool weather, and that belief that as long as you didn't hurt anybody, you could really do what you wanted in the Northwoods. Today, you cannot throw a rock in the Midwest without hitting a place that is thought to be tied to Al Scarface Capone. Hundreds of places around the Midwest all claim some sort of tie to Al and a lot of his colleagues. A lot of legends of Al being up in northern Michigan, up in the UP, the Iron River area. Al would go up quite a bit, checking on a lot of his product and making sure money was flowing back to his coffers in Chicago. He spent, according to legend, a lot of time at the Grand Hotel right out on the island. Many gangsters vacationed at the old hotel, coming up there and throwing around their money as though if they got rid of it, they could just go and get more of it. Down the road, they also stayed at the hotel that many people loved going to during the Prohibition era. Of course, many of you might recognize this as being the same hotel in Michigan that was the home in 1938 of the murder of a gangland lawyer. Isaiah Lieberov was one of the top lawyers for the gangsters out in New York. And he had a disagreement with somebody about some oil permits or money, of course. And he ended up being shot right in the hotel, point blank, with a ton of witnesses. It made national news because he was once the lawyer of the gangster out west, Mr. Rothstein. So Al spent a lot of time up in the UP. Exactly where, we don't know. Unfortunately, two things happened. Al did not keep a very good record of his crimes he was committing. And two, when they bought property in resorts and the like, they often bought it in fake names or under somebody else's name, knowing that the government would soon come for them. But one place we do know Al spent a little bit of time is up in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, near Coudray by Hayward, Wisconsin, at the aptly named Capone's hideout. Al had this nice cabin built in the 1920s where he could come up from Chicago and relax with his colleagues in luxury in the Northwoods. Both Al and his brother Ralph Bottles Capone were avid outdoorsmen, as were many gangsters of the era. They loved to hunt and fish and just be outside, especially taking target practice outside. But for Al, security was his number one concern, which is why he had towers built on his property where he would have his guards up there 24 hours a day with their Tommy guns, watching the entrances and exits of the building. Meaning that if you tried to show up to Al's uninvited, you'd probably receive a very unwelcome response. For years, Al stayed there, and then the place turned into a tourist attraction, a roadside attraction where you could pay and go touring. Those who did often were confused by this building. At first, they had no idea what it was used for. But as soon as they got closer, they realized this is where Al did a lot of his negotiating with his competitors. he would bring them up, put them in jail, and if they did not see his way of doing things, they would end up at the bottom of his private pond where he had spirits flown in from Canada, illegally, of course. Now, the gangsters loved the Midwest, but one place a lot of the big name gangsters did not go was southern Michigan, the Detroit area, which was operated at the time by the Purple Gang. These gangsters ran everything in the Detroit greater vicinity: drugs, prostitution, gambling, racketeering, everything you can imagine they had their hand in, both legitimate businesses and, let's just say, not so legitimate businesses. And they were always taking one another out. The number of crimes and murders that were happening from the Purple Gang kept them busy for many years during Prohibition. But they weren't the only gangsters roaming around. They were the best known in Michigan, but throughout the country, other gangs got a larger and more infamous reputation. People often ask if Bonnie and Clyde ever made their way to the Midwest. And the short answer is yes, but not often. They liked to stay down south where they had friends and family that could protect and hide them. Plus, many of the Midwestern gangsters thought they were just ignorant young teenagers off on a legend trip of crime, which in some way they kind of were. So they didn't make their way up to the Midwest very often, but they did make their way to Iowa on several occasions. On this occasion, they were hanging out in Dexter, Iowa, at Dexfield Park, an abandoned rural area. They were recovering from a shootout that had happened a few days before. So when the farmer found a bunch of bandages covered in blood, he thought it must be gangsters, since America had gangster fever at the time. And they got a posse together, surrounded Bonnie and Clyde and their gang, and they started blasting. A gunfight broke out where Clyde's brother, Buck Barrel, was shot in the head and later died. His wife, Blanche, was arrested at the scene, but somehow in all the confusion, Bonnie and Clyde escaped. They made their way out of Iowa. Today, there's a great placard there. You can go and see the marker where the Bonnie and Clyde's gang were captured in Iowa. But if you're ever bored on a rainy day, or I don't know, during a pandemic, I recommend you start flipping through the old newspapers of the Prohibition era. Many of them are online. The library probably has access to a lot of them. You'd be amazed at how much crime was going on every single day during Prohibition. It's really unbelievable how much crime was taking place. If you turn on the news today and think it's full of crime, you'll be amazed at Prohibition era. And most of the criminals, they were terrible at it. They had no business being criminals. They were captured right away. They didn't think out their plans, much like this next gentleman who decided to rob the bank where many of you are watching this from. It was 1931, and he robbed a local bank for alimony payments. He robbed the bank thinking he could pay off his wife and a lot of his debts. But he wasn't very good at it because he was caught within 24 hours. His name was Cecil Britnow, which some of you might be an ancestor or a relative of yours, which is often the case when I do these programs. But he only stole $1,100 from the bank, and he got sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. When they caught him the next day, he still had $966 left from his robbery. So obviously, it was not a very thought out plan. So Cecil should not have even stepped one foot into the world of crime. But other criminals, they seem to be born to do what they did. That's exactly the case with the Barker Karpus gang, perhaps the deadliest gangsters ever to set foot in the Midwest. The gang, which was made up of Elvin Creepy Karpis, remember prisoner St. Paul, and whatever Barker boys happened to be out of prison at the time. What Karpis was doing running with the Barkers, I don't know. Karpis was thought to be one of the most intelligent gangsters of all time. So why he was chumming with the Barkers, who let's just say were not the most intelligent, maybe that's why they loved him and he loved them. But before we talk about the gang, we have to address the legend of the Barkers' mother, Ma Barker. Many of you are probably familiar with the legend of Ma, and it goes something like this. Ma was this gun-toting mastermind criminal who took her young, innocent boys off on a life of crime, turning them into criminals. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We know Ma traveled with her boys. She had to have known they were criminals, but she had no active role in the participation or planning of the crimes. We'll catch up with Ma a little bit later down in Florida, and you'll see how the legend of Ma began. But where Ma lacked in her criminal intent, her kids more than made up for it. When they came to the Midwest, trouble followed them. You might recall this was the gang that back in 1933 kidnapped William Ham of the Ham's Brewing fortune. They kept him for a $100,000 ransom, quite a sum of money back then. They treated him pretty well. They fed him. They even brought him beer. They didn't give him hams. They didn't want to torture the poor guy, but they let him go relatively unharmed. Less than a year later, they took Edward Bremer from the Bremer banking fortune. They kept him for a $200,000 ransom. Again, a lot of money, but they didn't like kidnapping. They thought it was beneath them. They thought they were bank robbers. They only did it because it was easy and it gave them money to pay off the local police and politicians so they could have safe homes throughout the Midwest. One of those safe homes is still available today. It's in St. Paul and it's on South Robert Street. They were renting this place out from the landlady next door. They were renting it out under the guise of being musicians traveling with their senior mother. The landlady thought it was weird that they didn't seem to play in a band, but her son worked at a speakeasy. And one night it was slow. He happened to be flipping through an old detective magazine when all of a sudden he saw a wanted poster for those musicians living next to his mother. He immediately went down to the police station and said, "I'm here to collect the reward. The Barker Karpis gang's renting my mother's home." They put him in a back room and said, "Don't worry, you're going to be a hero. We'll take care of this problem with one phone call." Unfortunately, word got to Big Tom Brown, perhaps the most corrupt police officer in Midwest history. But even though he was corrupt, he was a man of his word. He said he'd take care of the problem with one phone call, and he did. Guess who he called? The Barker Karpis gang. He said, "The feds are going to raid your place. Get the heck out of there." So that's what they did. They had no idea it was this wanted poster that had done them in. They thought it was Ma's boyfriend, Arthur Dunlop. When he was drinking, he was an alcoholic. And when he became intoxicated, he would brag about the exploits of the gang. So the Barker gang had to get him out of Minnesota. It was just too hot. So they thought they would take him on a nice little vacation to Wisconsin. But this wasn't the type of vacation you'd want to go on, because this was one of those vacations you didn't come back from. They brought him up near Siren in the Webster area to a place called Fremstead Lake, photographed here. There they shot him several times, dumped his naked body on the side of the lake, threw a bunch of money on it to make it look like a mob hit. Years later, after retiring, the local sheriff used to go around jokingly saying that this was the most profitable case he never investigated. They didn't care. Another dead gangster. When I dug up his death certificate, they had to list his occupation, which is about midway down on your left side. And they wrote unknown, suspected underworld character. Kind of a cool title to have back then, although usually meant you'd be dead on the side of a lake. But when the gangsters weren't robbing our banks or kidnapping us, they liked to relax at all the speakeasies that littered the Midwest. And when I say they littered the Midwest, they were everywhere. In fact, in the Midwest, I think prohibition was more of a suggestion than it was a law, because these speakeasies and brothels were everywhere. During Prohibition, speakeasies were places you could go and illegally drink, you could gamble, you could dance the night away, partake in one of the ladies of the night that worked at these places. One of their favorite places is a place you can still go to. It's the Wabasha Street Caves in St. Paul. It started out as a mushroom factory and became the hottest speakeasy throughout the entire Midwest. One story tells that sometime back in the 1920s or early 30s, like all good legends, nobody knows exactly when, 4 men were playing cards when the waitress went out to refresh their drinks and to top off their cocktails. She heard the sound of a Tommy gun going off. She came back to find 3 of the men dead, the man with the gun running out the door. She notified the police. They came and said, "We'll take care of it." 1 hour later, they brought her back to the room and threatened to arrest her for wasting their time. They had cleaned up those bodies as though nothing had happened, but the bodies weren't removed. They were buried in the back of the caves, where legend is they still are to this very day. And even though everyone knew the police were corrupt, nobody believed this woman, except for the fact that she had proof, physical proof you can see today. Because if you go there for swing dance night every Wednesday or a gangster tour every Saturday and Sunday, look above the old fireplace mantle, you'll see the bullet holes from that card game gone awry. But my absolute favorite story happened in 1934 there. There was a dance going on. A woman was approached by a stranger. Normally, she wouldn't have accepted the dance, but something about the man's confidence really intrigued her. She had a dance, and immediately everybody came running over to her, asking if she knew who she was dancing with. She said she had no idea. She wished he would have stayed. He was a great dancer. Well, the man left with his buddies when all of a sudden, everyone ran over and said, "That was John Dillinger you were dancing with." Well, the last person in the world you'd want to be dancing with in 1934 was exactly Dillinger. So Dillinger was there like many gangsters of the time. Now, if you don't know Dillinger, you forgot his story. Dillinger was a bank robber back in 1933 and 1934. Perhaps the most infamous gangster of all time. They used to show Dillinger's wanted poster before movies, like trailers are shown today. People would stand up and start cheering for Dillinger. Believe it or not, they thought he was some type of folk hero. But regardless of what you thought of Dillinger, when he came to the Midwest, trouble seemed to follow him. For years, researchers believed that Dillinger did not make his way into Michigan. He loved Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, of course, even Iowa, South Dakota, but he hadn't made his way to Michigan. But that was wrong. He did make his way to Michigan on several occasions, up to Sault Ste. Marie area. He spent much time up there because the sister of one of his good pals, Three Finger Jack, lived in Sault Ste. Marie. In fact, the authorities found out and were arresting the sister of John Hamilton, Three Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton, for her aiding of Dillinger and her brother. We'll catch up in Sault Ste. Marie a little bit later as we find that maybe John Hamilton decided to make Michigan his permanent home. But Dillinger and his gang robbed banks all over the Midwest. Down in Racine, they robbed a bank in 1933 when they wanted to make a withdrawal from the American Bank and Trust. In fact, they wanted to take every penny the bank had. So on the morning of the robbery, they decided to pull around back. This is what it looks like today. Their plan was to leave the car running back there with Russell Clark, the getaway driver. Problem was that meant they would have to rob the bank, go all the way around the block and come back to the alleyway just to get away. But whether they didn't know this or they didn't care, or maybe they were bored with their lives, even though they were gangsters, they decided to rob the place anyway. So they went inside. Dillinger and his gang left Russell Clark with the car. When Dillinger ran in with his gang, which at the time was made up of Harry Pierpont, Three Finger Jack, John Red Hamilton, the Sault Ste. Marie man, and Charles Makeley, very deadly assassins. Makeley's the first one into the bank. He goes right up to the counter and says, "It's a stick up. Give us your money." The teller didn't even look up. He thought he was joking. He said, "Next window, please." Makeley shot him in the shoulder. That got his attention. It also got the police attention, and they raced to the building. Well, not exactly. You see, back then, false alarms were pretty common at banks, so the police took their time getting there. When they got there, the gangsters simply took them hostage as well. After scooping up all the money, the gangsters grabbed the security guard, a bank manager, and a young female teller. They loved to grab the young female tellers because that was where they were believing, rightly so, that the police would be less likely to shoot them if they had young girls as shields. So they scooped up some hostages and made their way out of town. Now, back then, the best way to get away from police was to keep a big bucket of roofing tacks in your back seat. Since the police had no two-way radios, all they could do was follow you. And the gangsters would throw these on the road as they left town. And the police would follow, pop their tires, and the chase would be over. That's exactly what the gangsters did. Very low-tech way of getting away. Today, the bank is no longer there. It's now the Racine Art Museum, or the RAM. But they do have the original bank vault there on display. Also, after the robbery, they collected some of the weapons of the gangsters, the bullet casings, and a lot of the news articles, and they put it all together for a nice little monument to John Dillinger. But my favorite part of this is where they put this monument, because what better place to put something for the world's greatest gangster? Where else should you put a monument for the most deadly gangster? Well, for that, there's only one place. You have to put it in your town's police department. That's exactly where it is, in the front lobby of the police station. But those of you who are currently on the lam from the law, I have to warn you, this is a working police station. You may want to stay away from this one and move on to our next location. And that's this gentleman, Lester Gillis. Out of all the gangsters I researched for the book and the program, I had the most fun with and the most trouble researching this gentleman. Known as Lester Gillis, I had the most trouble with him because I never knew what side of Babyface was going to pop up. On the one hand, those who knew him said he was a polite, well-mannered, jovial young man. He was also perhaps the best connected gangster of all time. If you needed a weapon, he could provide it. A safe house, an introduction to a fellow crook, he could do all of it. And at a time when they all had numerous mistresses, the malls as they were called, Babyface was said to be devoted to his wife Helen and their two young children. But before you start thinking of Babyface as some type of angel, remember I said there was a flip side, and that flip side was his temper. Many of his own colleagues did not like working with him. In fact, when they robbed a bank and had to divvy up the loot, they made a circle around him and let him hand out the money. He thought he was in charge, but in actuality, they formed the circle because nobody wanted their back to Babyface, thinking he might just shoot you and take your portion of the money. When he came to the Midwest, we saw both sides of him. Up in Minnesota, they robbed the First National Bank. Babyface, his good buddy John Paul Chase, Homer Van Meter, and Tommy Carroll. They waited for the maintenance man to come in, started robbing the place, which now looks like this. Things were going great. The alarms were not triggered. He had to smack some of the people around a little bit, but they scooped up tens of thousands of dollars. And as they were leaving, Babyface turned around and said, "We're leaving now. The first one of you to stick your head out the door is going to get it blown off." A threat he was more than capable of delivering on. So as he left, he lost his temper. He started shooting up the entire buildings of downtown. Now, witnesses remember seeing a lookout guard standing there with bib overalls, wearing a new suit underneath the bibs, carrying a picnic basket. They thought it was weird, but they would have thought it was weirder had they seen the gun in the picnic basket. But as soon as Babyface let out all those bullets, the police rushed to the scene. Many of those bullets are still visible in the downtown buildings. It got the police attention. They even tried to get an airplane into the sky to track the gangsters, but Babyface's gang did the same thing other gangs did and just threw the roofing tacks down on the ground. If you head up to Brainerd on vacation, or maybe you want to rob their banks, I recommend you stop by the local historical society's museum, because there on display, they have that picnic basket that was used in the robbery. You can go and see if any of your weapons fit inside the picnic basket. But the gangsters at this point in their career, they needed a rest, a relaxation. One place they heard about was a place up in Manitoush Waters, Wisconsin called Little Bohemia, exactly where my car popped that tire. It was the off season, April of 1934, which meant it was completely dead in the Northwoods. It wasn't filled with Chicago tourists like it is today. So the owners were very excited when a group of men pulled in, wanting to rent the entire place for the whole weekend. Money was no object. In fact, the owner said the men were throwing around money as though they had just robbed a bank. That should have been their first clue, but they needed the business. They were excited. But that excitement soon turned to fear when they noticed who walked through the front door. Because in 1934, this was a who's who of gangsters. Top left, John Dillinger. Top right, Babyface Nelson. Bottom right, Tommy Carroll. Middle of your screen on the bottom, Three-Fingered Jack, John Red Hamilton. And on the right, Tommy Carroll, or Homer Van Meter, excuse me, very, very deadly men. If the FBI could capture these men, they could throw away their most wanted list. They also had the malls with them. The softer side were there as well. In the beginning, the owners were excited. The men were tipping really well, buying all the drinks, telling amazing stories. The only thing that bothered the owners is all of the men seemed to have a large lump on the side of their jackets. Don't worry, they would figure out what those lumps were. They smuggled out information that Dillinger was in the Northwoods. They got word down to Chicago to Melvin Purvis, who was operating the Chicago division of the FBI. They flew into Rhinelander, Wisconsin. They met at Voss's Birchwood Lodge to come up with a plan as it got dark. Then they found out that Dillinger was about to leave that night instead of the next morning as planned. Dillinger had an uncanny knack of knowing when things weren't quite right. So all they could do was race to the location and wait for Dillinger to come out. Unfortunately, a little after 9 p.m. when they got there, 3 local men who had been eating and drinking there went out to go to their car to go home. The feds panicked. They thought it was Dillinger. They shot up the car, killing one of the men, injuring the other two. Well, now all hell broke loose at Little Bohemia. Babyface, who was staying in the side cabin because nobody wanted him in the main lodge, could have easily snuck into the woods undetected, but instead he came out guns blazing. Then he ran into the woods where he ended up killing an FBI agent and shooting many, many people on his escape. But he did buy Dillinger and his men enough time in the building to escape all the bullets that were being shot in to the establishment. And it provided them enough time to get away. Well, how did they escape? What was this elaborate escape plan? It was this. They simply crawled out the back window. The federal authorities, while trying to capture the most elusive men in the world, simply forgot to cover the back. They had no idea there was this ravine there that would protect the gangsters from view. Tommy Carroll hitchhiked his way right back to St. Paul. Dillinger took off running with Three Finger Jack and Homer Van Meter. At gunpoint, they were able to borrow a car from a gentleman, and they wanted to go back to St. Paul too. But because every radio station in America was blasting stories about Babyface shooting up the Northwoods, they thought it would be too hot. So they went through the southern town of Hastings, Minnesota, over this spiral bridge. Police saw the plates were stolen and gave chase for 20 miles. They had a shootout with the gangsters before Homer Van Meter swerved the car off the road. Later that day, they would find the abandoned vehicle of the gangsters. Judging by the amount of blood you see photographed here, the feds thought that whoever was sitting in the front passenger seat would probably die from their gun battle. And they were right. Three Finger Jack did die, or at least they believe he died when they found his grave 1 year later. But one theory is that wasn't the body of Three Finger Jack. Instead, it was the physician that refused to treat him, and that John Hamilton simply made his way back to Sault Ste. Marie and lived on his sister's farm for the rest of his life. Many people in Sault Ste. Marie and northern UP area remember seeing John Hamilton on the farm into the late 1930s and beyond, giving some the idea that maybe one of the most notorious gangsters of all time decided, hey, Northern Michigan sounds like a perfect place to retire. And that's what they said he did. I don't know. Maybe it was his body. Maybe he did. I like to think that he got what was due to him. But at the same time, I like to think that he was supporting the tourists up in Northern Michigan, doing his part with all the other unique people up there. Back at Little Bohemia, the police thought they had everyone captured. So when they shot tear gas in, they realized the only people coming out were the malls and employees. The only thing left behind were all the weapons, clothing artifacts, personal touches of all the gangsters, which is still on display at Little Bohemia. Much to their credit, they left the bullets in the windows from the gunfight that you can go see. But the gangsters couldn't go on forever. Death caught them, and it caught them very quickly. First stop, Tommy Carroll, Waterloo, Iowa. He was going to have his car serviced. Him and his girlfriend dropped it off and said, we'll come back in a few hours when it's completed. While they dropped it off, they forgot to cover up all the stolen license plates and weapons. And when they came back, the police were there waiting. Tommy Carroll tried to shoot them. They were too fast. They killed him on sight. And when they shot him down in Iowa, they found this stash of weapons, arsenal of bullets, ammunition, license plates. They knew they had got the right guy. Less than a month later, imagine you're down at the Biograph Theater in Chicago. You're there watching a movie when the guy sitting next to you looks a lot like John Dillinger. And it was Dillinger. He was being set up by a friend of his named Anna Sage, who ran some brothels, and she was Romanian and being threatened with deportation. So she believed if she could turn in Dillinger, not only would she get the reward, they'd have to let her stay in America as well. So that's what she did. She turned in Dillinger. And for her reward, the US government shipped her back to Romania. So Dillinger gets out of the movie, starts walking, sees the FBI there, tries to run into this alleyway to get away, and they shoot him, and he bleeds to death waiting for help to arrive in the alleyway. But the night just didn't stop there. Thousands of people started gathering under the Biograph Theater. They got Johnny, they got Dillinger. Can you believe it? And they didn't stop there. They walked into the alleyway. Now, again, word of caution. I'm going to show you what they did in the alleyway. So close your eyes if you'd rather not see it. Here we go. They dipped their newspaper or handkerchief into the blood of Dillinger as a grisly souvenir. When they were done there, they followed him to the morgue where women cut locks of his hair. More blood was stolen. Photographs of his naked, bloody body were photoed. Okay, photos are gone. For years, you used to be able to go to the Biograph on the anniversary of Dillinger's death and watch the same movie he was watching. But you no longer can do it, so you're going to have to watch Manhattan Melodrama from the safety of your own home. Babyface was the next to go. He was wanting to stay in southern Wisconsin when he pulled into a resort that he had stayed at many times before because it was owned by a fellow gangster. The feds were there waiting, but they didn't recognize him. So he turned around, drove off, made his way through Lake Geneva, wanted to get back to Chicago. He was with his wife and his good friend, John Paul Chase. On the way to Chicago, they saw 2 carloads of FBI agents coming up from Chicago to Wisconsin. Babyface drove his car off the road onto their street, ran one of them into a ditch, the other one into this park in Barrington near Chicago. He got out and started walking toward their car, shooting them. They're shooting him, he's shooting them. By the time he reaches their vehicle, he realizes he's full of bullets, but they're in no condition to fire back. So he simply kicks them out of their car and drives off in it. They put a memorial plaque for those agents because both of them ended up dying from their gunfight with Babyface. The next day, Babyface's dead body was found on the side of the road. He too had died. I'm going to show you his morgue photo. If you'd rather not see it, close your eyes. Here's Babyface dead at the age of 25. Okay, photo's gone. The last of the big names to go was Ma and Fred Barker. They were staying down in Florida at this lake home in January 1935. Neighbors had no idea who they were. They thought they were the best neighbors you could have. They would hand out candy and coins to kids and give rides in their fancy automobiles. But the government found out who they were. According to their version of events, they knocked on the door, and when Ma answered, they asked her to surrender peacefully, which Ma said, "Let's see what Freddie and his guns have to say about surrendering." Meanwhile, in reality, researchers of that era believed that the government opened fire immediately without warning, and that Ma and Fred were both killed in the first 30 seconds of the gun battle. But for the next several hours, every time the wind blew a curtain or a screen door, the government shot up the house thinking it was the gang. It went on so long, neighbors put lawn chairs out front and watched it like it was some reality TV show. Eventually, after many hours of no firing coming from inside, the government finally garnered the courage to send the Barkers' hired maintenance man in to see what was going on. And that's when they discovered that Ma was a dead, unarmed senior with mild at best intelligence. And they thought to themselves, maybe the public would not like us going around shooting unarmed seniors. So they concocted this story that Ma was this mastermind criminal and public enemy number one. When the story started spreading through the media, those who knew Ma best started laughing, saying that old woman couldn't plan breakfast, much less a bank robbery. But that's how the legend of Ma Barker began. And she paid with her life, as so did her son. Again, word of caution, I'll show you their bullet-riddled bodies in the morgue. Turn away, close your eyes. Here we go. Here's Ma and Fred dead in the morgue. Okay, photo's gone. Now, the neighbors, I said, even when they found out they were gangsters, they loved them. They even named their local watering hole Ma Barker's Hideaway. You can go there and do some shots or take some shots if you choose. But besides dying, the gangster era could not go on forever. And it ended for three main reasons. One, obviously, the repeal of Prohibition. Two, the FBI got much better at fighting these men and women very quickly and protecting us from these criminals. But the third and most important reason was because of us. When they were robbing banks, people didn't really seem to care. When they were bootlegging, people cared even less. It wasn't until they started shooting us and kidnapping us that we turned them in for the outrageous sums of money being offered. So it leaves us with the question, were these folk heroes or criminals or something in between? And that's where I leave it up to you to come to your own conclusion. But regardless of what you make of the individuals, I think what should be celebrated is the history in which they operated. Not only did they change America's laws, they changed the laws in the Midwest and the history throughout the area as well. And I think that's what should be celebrated. If you want more information, my website, Chad Lewis Research, has more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here at the program. Grab one of my books. Go on your own adventure of the Midwest. When you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird area. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some odd characters. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. But you may want to heed the advice of these next travelers, because in the Midwest, who knows what could happen. Don't shoot, I ain't Dillinger. So with that, again, I want to thank the library for putting this together. It's very rare that you can come to a program like this at no cost. Check out a wealth of information from the library. So if you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But either way, they put a ton of work into getting me here. And I can't think of a time in America's history in which the library has played a more important role than it does in today's world. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, societal issues, the library is the fabric that keeps our communities together, a real treasure for anyone that has one. So to show my appreciation, if you want to get any of my books from my website, type in the coupon code library and get 20% off, just because libraries are so amazing. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. If you have questions, either put them in the chat, or I don't know if Sarah wants maybe unmute yourself. I don't know. So I'll stop sharing. I'll turn on my camera. If you have questions, comments, or stories, I'd love to hear them.
Thank you so much, Chad. And thank you for the plug for libraries all the time, but also during this last year. We have been working very hard. I do have a few questions. The first one came pretty early. How many were killed in the Chicago Valentine's Day massacre?
7 individuals met their fate there. And obviously they believe that area is haunted, but from that tragedy, they used to have recreations of it. Up at Al's hideout in Wisconsin, they had a whole building devoted to it, the cars, and they went through the soundtrack of what happened in that. And the case was never officially solved, although most people think Al Capone was responsible. But the police, you know, they really didn't care about a lot of these gangsters dying. If an innocent bystander got hit in the aftermath or something, then they would get more involved. Right. But a lot of them were on the payroll as well.
Yeah. Okay, KJ asks, are there any questions that you haven't found the answers to yet?
Oh, and gosh,
project.
More questions than answers in this research. again, so much of it is speculation. That I've talked to people who said their grandparents ran into Al Capone at a time when Al was in Alcatraz prison. So it couldn't have been Al. Maybe it was a different gangster or a different time. They got the dates mixed up. But so much of this is we don't know exactly. Like, as I mentioned, you can't go anywhere up north where you are and then the UP area without some resort, some lake having a tie to either a big name gangster or just being an old brothel or a resort town where gambling was allowed during Prohibition or drinking was allowed. It was a wet area. So, but who was there when? We don't know. They did not, even the FBI files are lacking unless there was a shootout or a bank robbery or a murder. We don't know quite a bit about what these people were doing on their off time. One thing that was a bit difficult is when I went to all these locations, many of them I expected they'd have like a big pamphlet of history and newspaper articles, but most of the time I ended up telling them more than they told me, that they had no idea about the history of their place. And that for me was the shame of the research, is that more places weren't embracing this history, not glorifying it or looking at it with rose-colored glasses or romanticizing these people, because they were stone cold killers, don't get me wrong, but the history that is
Embracing the history.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, for me, that was the hardest thing about going to these places, is I would get excited sitting down saying, Babyface Nelson sat right here. How cool is that? John Dillinger was right there. But it wouldn't have been that cool if I was the one they were shooting at back then. So it was a balancing act to kind of keep that excitement in check, thinking these were not guys you wanted to run into, you know, so being excited just to be in the same location, you know, it felt wrong at times.
Yeah, I get that. Have you been to Petoskey?
I have, passing through. I did a book on the Michigan's haunted locations, a road guide. So
Okay.
I did the entire state, UP, and then down below where all the trolls live. So I made my way there quite a bit, but not any substantial amount of time.
Okay. I mean, there's some rumor. I mean, I hear that we have like an underground Prohibition tunnel going from a local City Park grill to possibly our local hardware store that was used during Prohibition. So I haven't seen it myself, but
Most cities
have. So
yeah, most cities had those tunnels underground where liquor could be moved out of the watchful eye. And unfortunately, many of them, while maybe for public health, were locked off or boarded up, and they did away with them. But same thing, every city, people say, I know someone who was actually down there when you could get in there. So yeah, it'd be fascinating to see what's in those tunnels now. If anything, if they're not flooded out or.
Right. Very cool. Well, I've got a lot of positive feedback. Does anybody have any other questions for Chad?
And keep in mind, these were just the biggest name gangsters. Imagine the thousands of others and the mom and pop, the grandma and grandpa who had a still on their farm because they didn't believe in Prohibition. And I hear from so many people who say, yeah, grandma ran a still, or grandpa delivered moonshine or spirits.
How'd they get away with operating a still like that during Prohibition?
Almost 99% of the arrests that came from people operating stills came at the federal level. The FBI came in and it wasn't done locally because the police probably had a still themselves, or they turned a blind eye to it because many of them didn't think it was right not to have the spirits from the old countries. You know, they just felt it was wrong. So I'm amazed, and this is a new line of research I've been doing recently, of all the telephone code names and code words they had at like the hardware store, that if the feds were coming in, they would tell people like the chickens are, ready to hatch or something like that. And that meant everybody clean up everything you have. And it spread through a town like wildfire. The clergy were involved quite a bit throughout the Midwest in bootlegging. I mean, they went to the point where local producers of spirits would put their spirits in the back of a dugout gravestone with a hollow back, put it in there, and the gangsters would pick it up and leave money, and they'd go back and there'd be a ton of cash there. No deal ever transpired. So yeah, it's hard to overstate how many people were involved in Prohibition that weren't criminals per se, normal
Right.
law-abiding citizens who just felt they had the right to wine or spirits and other things.
Yeah. Okay, I have another question, Chad. The FBI agent who shot Dillinger, did he use this same gun to commit suicide?
Well, Purvis was there, and they're probably talking about Purvis. The legend is he used the same weapon that he used when he was in the FBI, and Purvis made the mistake of becoming too famous, or at least more famous than Hoover, his boss, and that was his downfall. And he did spiral out of control. He ended up committing suicide later in his life, unfortunately. And the legend was, yes, he used the same weapon that he was issued during his time as a gangster hunter. And out of all the gangsters, the big names, the only one to survive was Creepy Karpis. He was arrested in New Orleans, and he went to Alcatraz, spent more time there altogether than any other prisoner. But when he was released, he went back to Canada, and then he headed down south and he either overdosed or committed suicide on drugs. We don't know, but everyone else was wiped out. And remember, these were all young men. Dillinger, the grandfather, if you will, was 31 when he died.
Yeah,
Babyface
wow.
was 25. Homer Van Meter, 28. I mean, these were kids.
Yeah, when you put their
kids,
ages
but-
up there, I was just blown away that they're that young.
Yeah. And I mean, they were deadly young people, but they were, yeah.
They were young.
And there's a great book. I forget the name. It's called Gangsters Up North, or something of that effect. The library probably can get you a copy, done by a Michigan author talking about all the local gangs in Michigan during Prohibition era, which is a fantastic read if you want some of those lesser known gangsters, but just as fascinating of all the crime that went on in Michigan, because we don't often think of Michigan as being the heart of gangster territory like Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota were, but there were plenty that went, especially into the Detroit area.
Mm-hmm.
Some say there's still gangsters all over the Midwest, but the mob, but that's a different story.
Did Dillinger ever kill anyone? Or did he, I mean, I guess the end of this question is, or did he just have his gang do it? I thought he was always a part of the killing, but maybe not.
If you believe Dillinger, he didn't kill anyone. If you believe facts and the truth, he killed several people, but he went out of his way to try not to. It was always, well, as much as you can not to shoot someone, but it was always to save himself. He was either going to be captured or killed, so he did what he had to do to survive. But Dillinger, out of all the gangsters, I think, was the most aware of his public perception. And remember, this was in the 1930s when stories would percolate day after day after day for months. It's not like it is today where the big story today is gone tomorrow. Something new has replaced it. So these stories built. So the legend of Dillinger progressed and morphed. And so whenever they kidnapped young women for hostages, for shields, he made sure no one swore. They treated them well, gave them their coats, make sure they were warm, and left them unharmed with plenty of money to get back to town, because he knew those stories would leak and that he needed the public's help in escaping. So he made sure his public profile was much cleaner than he actually was. But many believe that, so Dillinger, as a young man, tried to rob a grocery store with his buddy. They were very young and they didn't hurt anyone. They didn't get any money. It was a terrible idea. But his lawyer said, plead guilty, the judge will go lenient on you. Well, the judge gave him over a dozen years in prison. So Dillinger, when he came out, he was dead within a year of being released from prison. But in that year, he became the most famous bank robber. But many people believe that if Dillinger or Al Capone or some of the others would have taken a different path in life, they could have headed up a Fortune 500 company. that they just had that charismatic energy and leadership that people responded to, but they went a different way, a life of crime.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right, that's all the questions I have. Does anybody else have any questions they want to ask Chad while we're still on? I mean, we could go on and on with this, I feel like, but no other questions? All right, well, thank you so much, Chad. This was great. It was, I mean, I'm like a huge fan of this topic, so I really enjoyed it. And I hope everyone else did too.
Keep an eye out, everyone.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you back sometime, Chad, on another, topic of your many topics that you've
Yes.
the world investigating. I love it. Okay. Good night, everyone.